Hey Ken, this is Greg. I took your advice and I'm going to record these lessons for To Kill a Mockingbird. Alright, you guys look up here. Alright, you can see this book is wrapped. I went over to Barnes & Noble on Christmas break and they had half-price sale for all hardback books in the store. So while I was there, I picked up 2 books to give 2 people here at the end of reading this book. This is a reproduction of the original book. If you look down the side, it's gold plated or gold, whatever whatever that's called. There's things that's on this book. On the cover, you got this little girl. You probably can't see it from there. You got this little girl. She's looking in a tree, and there's a house there. And on the side, there's some things on the side. And some of the books that I give you will have some of these things as well. That all pertains to the book. And in the on the back here, there's a little girl and a boy and a dad. And those are pretty much the main characters in this book. This book is called To Kill a Mockingbird. It's been around for 60 years now. It is the most taught book in the United States in education. It's my favorite book to teach. And I've got things I want to start with so that you understand, you have a good background of what we're talking about here. All right, first of all, setting is important to this story. Setting's not always important all the time, but setting is important in this story. And I should change my ink color to black. I think I will. All right. Without the correct setting, the things that happen in this story would not necessarily make really good sense. But here is the setting. The time setting is the Great Depression. Who can tell me about the Great Depression? When was the Great Depression and what happened during the Great Depression?
It was like in the early 20th century.
Okay. All right, October. Yeah, go ahead.
Didn't everybody lose their jobs?
Not everybody, but a lot of people did. October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. And suddenly, most people in the United States, this actually wasn't as bad here in the United States as it was in other parts of the world, but a lot of people lost their jobs. We had 25% unemployment. That's a lot. So it's 1 out of every 4 adults who wanted to work could not find a job. We had people who lost their homes and lost their farms, but it really didn't make a difference in the final analysis. Most people during the Great Depression had no money to begin with. There just was no money, and there were very few jobs. And if you had a job and you worked during the Great Depression, you were fortunate. The place setting is in the South, the southern states of the United States, in particular the state of Alabama. All right, because it's in the South, makes a big difference to the plot of this story. This book is about 3 different types of relationships that's in the story. And you know the relationships I'm talking about. First of all, it's a political book. And someone tell me what do I mean by political when I say political? No, it's not government necessarily. All right, it's who has power and who doesn't. I want to write that in your notes, I'm sure. A political book is about, something that's political is about who has power and who doesn't. And this book is full of political relationships here. And I'll explain a few here in a little bit. So it's not just a political book, it's also a book about class. All right? And you know the 3 classes, upper, middle, lower class. And it's about the conflict that sometimes can occur between people in different classes. And I will get to it in just a few minutes. I will get to you and I'll explain the class structure and how everything worked. And the last set of relationships are social. And what I mean by social is how a person relates to his or her neighbor. And a neighbor being defined as someone who you're not related to. Okay? So, you need to know these for the test. I can guarantee you something about this will be on the test. What are the three types of relationships? Political, class, and social. I don't care which order you put them in. All right? Again, political is who is in power, who has the power, and who doesn't. Class is the conflict between different classes of society. And social is the relationship between people who are neighbors. And they don't have to be next door neighbors. They can be people, different towns, whatever. Okay? Everybody have this? Okay. So, once again, as a quick review, the setting, the time setting is the Great Depression. The place setting is the South, Southern United States, and Alabama. All right. Why is the place setting, why is that important? Great Depression, 1930s. Go ahead, Micah.
Racism?
Yeah, racism. This book, that's a good answer. This book is essentially a book about racism. Okay? And when we're talking political, almost getting ready to get ahead of myself. You're talking about who has the power in a society and who does not. Quick and broad, and not very detailed analysis. What happened after the Civil War? The North won. Am I in here still? All right, that's fine. All right, the North won. The Union side won the American Civil War. As a result of that, we had, I don't remember what amendment it is, but there's a particular, is it the 13th Amendment? Guaranteed freedom for slaves. All right, people who were formerly slaves. And if you can imagine, if you lived in the South and you were a black person at the end of the Civil War and suddenly the war was over and you were told you had your freedom, what do you think the people who had the power at that time, the whites, the slave owners, what do you think was their response to granting blacks their freedom?
Not good,
Why?
because they like their slaves. They don't like the power.
They liked the power. Yeah, they liked the power that they had. You know, whites and blacks. Yeah, I mean the whites had total rule. The slave owners had total rule over their slaves and over their blacks. So the government stepped in, said you can't have slaves anymore. Who do you think was in power in all the southern states as far as their government was concerned?
Racist.
They were whites. The blacks were not, they were not in power. The whites were still in power. So what did they do? They wrote laws that essentially eliminated blacks from having rights. Okay? Let me give you a short example. All right, before and during the Civil War, I don't know if you guys know this or not, it was illegal to teach a black person to read and write. It was against the law in the southern United States. All right, so what effect did that have on the blacks after the Civil War? Well, what kind of jobs could they get? They couldn't read, they couldn't write, couldn't add, couldn't subtract. Most of them couldn't. Some could, but most couldn't. So it limited them to what types of jobs that they could have. Now, next word I want you to know is the word segregation. All right, the word itself is not a bad word, but when you're talking about it in racial terms, it has a negative connotation, a bad connotation. The word segregate simply means to separate. My wife washes my socks all together at one time. I have a bag that I put my socks in. When it's over, she brings the pile of socks out to me, and I segregate the socks and I match them up according to the pairs of socks. All right, so that's not a bad word by itself. However, when you're talking about in racial terms, segregation is a very bad word. It means we separate the races, the blacks from the whites. And all throughout the South, from the time after the Civil War until, in some places, in the 1970s, all into the 1970s. Any of y'all ever seen, Remember the Titans?
Yes.
All right? It's set in Virginia, which is a southern state. All right, it was 1970 something, and the court ruled that they merged these schools. They had blacks come into the white school, and people didn't like it. Back in the 1970s in Louisville, we had busing took place, which we were, up until that time, you had schools that were all black and schools that were all white. And the people in Louisville, Kentucky, did not like the fact that they had to, they had to mix blacks and whites. And they protested. They had these huge protests there. I remember still watching it in 1975. They had these huge protests out on the expressway, and they closed down the interstate. And all the people were protesting. We don't want the black students in our school. So anyway, the South, they made up these rules and these laws that essentially segregated blacks from whites. All right? And if you visited a typical town, up until about the 1950s in the South, and maybe even, I don't know about Mississippi, it was the worst. All right? 60s maybe. You would go to a town, and you could walk down the street, and they would have public restrooms out there. And they would have a sign on one door that said whites only. And then they had a sign on the other one, I'm going to use a term that's termed back then, it said coloreds only, all right, blacks, all right. And then you'd walk down the street, there'd be a public water, there'd be two water fountains. There'd be a sign on one that said whites only, and it'd be a really nice water fountain, and it would be all clean and spiffy and everything. And then the one next to it said coloreds only, or blacks only, all right. And it would be all gnarly, and you wouldn't want to drink out of it. They had certain hotels that only whites could stay in. Other hotels that only blacks could stay in. Certain parts of town, only whites could stay in. Certain parts of towns, only blacks would stay in. The biggest areas was in the area of education. And they came up with this theory. Some of you may have heard this before. Separate but equal. All right, and what they used this to justify it, and it finally took a Supreme Court decision, either in the 50s or the 60s, I think it was the 50s, to do away with this. It had been around for 80, 90 years. And what they did, they used this to justify, yeah, we don't want blacks in our school, we'll give them their own schools, and they'll be separate, but they're going to be equal. Now, in reality, this is the way that it worked. White schools would get about 90% of the state funds for education. Black schools would get old books that the white schools had tossed aside. Their buildings would be substandard compared to the white schools. And they'd get about 10% of the money that the white schools got. And that was the result of separate but equal. The goal for the people who were in power, this is the political part, the goal for the people who were in power in the South was that the whites would remain in power, and the blacks would be, even though they're no longer slaves, they would be subservient to the whites. The whites would get all the advantages. Go back to the Great Depression. Who do you think were the first people to lose their jobs?
Black.
Blacks, right, mainly, all right? A bunch of other things as well. And they would be the last ones to be hired if there was hiring to be done. So essentially, our society, at least in the southern part of our country, was set up so that we had blacks and whites that were separate in almost everything. There's the thing, and I'm going to have you do some research on this. Maybe one of your research projects. Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was not a nice term for a black person. Okay? They were called Jim Crow laws. And what the Jim Crow laws did is they kept whites and blacks separate. If you went to a baseball game in the South, up until about 1960 or so, they had sections that they called the Jim Crow sections. And they were a small section in a far corner of the stadium, and that's where blacks could sit. Whites could sit anywhere else they wanted, they could buy tickets for, you know. But blacks had to sit in a separate section all by themselves. And they were just terrible, awful seats. And these Jim Crow laws were not just to do with sports, they had to do with a lot of things. You know, like where you could stay, where, you know, what hotel you could stay in, what house you could live in, stuff like that. All right. Everybody have all this? You should. All right. I want to talk to you about, and I want you to make sure you get this. Sorry, I got out of the picture here. I want you to make sure you get this. This has always, every time I've taught this book, this has always been an essay question. Am I still in there? Okay.
No, yeah, no, you are.
All right. This is 100% of the tests that I've given I've given this as a test. Test question. All right. In the South, you had 3 classes of people: upper class, middle class, and lower class. Now again, this is the Great Depression. Nobody had money then, all right? But society was still segregated between upper, middle, and lower class. And this is how they were segregated. In the upper class, you had the people that lived in the towns. They were town folk. Okay? And these were people who worked jobs, non-farming jobs. All right? Even though they had no money, they were still considered the upper class. And these are the people who pretty much had the power in a town. I'm talking about political. The middle class consisted of the farmers. Now, farmers were hugely, badly affected by the Great Depression. Okay? You know, they couldn't sell anything because nobody could buy anything. How do farmers earn a living? They farm, they sell their produce, whatever they produce. And they were tremendously affected by the Great Depression. And you're going to find an example of a farmer early in this book where literally they had zero money, not even a penny. All right? And then the lower class, you're not going to understand this at all, but I'm just going to write it up here. You'll understand it as we read the book. You had the group of people, this is pronounced Yules, like Yules. All right? All right, this is pronounced Yules. And these are the people who, they never, even when times were good, they never did anything to produce anything for society. They were always takers. They were consumers. They weren't producers. And they had very little education. They had very little training. They had no manners, no sense of social responsibility, and they were happy with the way they were. They hated basically the farmers and the town people because they were the lowest people on the social scale. And no one liked them either. They were just not pleasant people to be around. All right? Now this is the way society was set up in the South for whites. You draw an imaginary line under the Yules, and below them are the blacks. All right? And I want you to make this as part of your notes. At no time whatsoever was a black person allowed to cross that line and to move into white society. It was an unwritten rule. It wasn't a law. It was just the way society ran. All right? Again, who has all... These are white people here. They had all the power. All right? And the blacks had no power whatsoever. None. All right? And at no time would anybody above the imaginary line, would they cross that line to associate with black people. Now, I want to make sure you understand. In this story, we have a black woman who's working for one of the main characters. That's allowed. Blacks could get jobs in white society, but they were always the worst jobs. They were housekeepers and cooks, the women were, for the whites. And that's about all they could do. The black men, most of the time, would have to end up going out in the fields to pick and to cultivate things. That was their main jobs. Okay? So, again, this is the way that society was set up in the South. Again, what state are this book take place? Alabama. Alabama's a southern state. My daughter-in-law's from Alabama. All right. She's nice. All right. She gets this. She understands this. All right. So anyway, again, this is the way society was set up. You had the three classes, upper, middle, and lower, and then an imaginary line was drawn, and the blacks were beneath that, and they were not allowed for any reason to socially cross this line and to consider themselves an equal with any white person, regardless of the class. Okay? So they were not allowed to consider themselves an equal with any white person. I'm not going to write it on the board, but I want you to write it in your notes. When it came down to whose word was believed by the courts or by the town or society or whatever, the word of a white person was always, 100% of the time, taken over the word of a black. There was never any doubt in their minds. And this is essential to understanding the story. You'll see it when we get there, all right? Because a white person accuses a black person of doing something. All right? And it's obvious the black person didn't do it. All right? So, you could have one white person accuse a black person, and you could have witnesses. The black person, you could call 10 of his or her friends, to court to testify, and if they all said the same thing, but it contradicted what the white person said, guess whose word was taken? The white person. Yes, ma'am.
It probably didn't happen ever, or even that often if it did. If somebody from the upper middle or lower part, like the white part or whatever, decided that they wanted to defend or stand up for blacks, would they cross that imaginary line?
Yes, and actually that happens in this story. And that creates the huge conflict.
So whites can cross the line, but blacks can't?
No, the whites will never cross this line.
Most of the time they don't want to.
Right, because they never want a black person to consider themselves an equal with any white person. Even the lowest, even the Yules.
There is racism inside race.
Yeah, yes it is. Yes, ma'am.
Does the book explain why it's called To Kill a Mockingbird?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I'm not going to explain it.
Someone kills a
All right, actually, you can write that down on your paper. There is a question that I almost always ask as an essay question, and the question is, explain the meaning of the title of this book, To Kill a Mockingbird. I almost always ask that
Because
question.
there's a step-by-step guide in it on how to hunt mockingbirds.
Yeah, right. That's not what it means. All right, any questions about this? I mean, this is really what you need to understand in order to understand this book. You have to understand the times in which this book takes place and why people acted the way they did. Okay? All right, I got some good questions as we get along in the book. Always do. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
This is from the start. What made white people believe that they were higher? Is it religious, God's why, blah blah blah, like that, or what?
They look different. They look dirty. But no one knew.
All right, this is probably too complicated of an answer for me to give you an answer, but the slave trade from Africa, you know about the slave trade and the triangle. All right, go from Europe to Africa, pick up a shipload of slaves. go to South and North America, drop them off and sell them, then go back to England and sell the things, other things that they had taken. And it was just, you know, the triangle. And the whites had just been in power for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, and they went to, and slavery's not a new thing. It didn't just start then. It's been going on since almost
Isn't
the first
slavery's,
people.
like highest percentage like right now?
Do what now?
Isn't like slavery's highest percentage like literally right now?
I don't think so. I would say probably
Slavery, right?
before the American Civil War was about the highest time.
No, but
All right, and that is, but that's a good question. There is still slavery going on in the world today. All right, not necessarily in the United States, in Africa. It's mainly in Africa. All right, and so you know the whites had. I mean, they would take their ships. They'd go to Africa. They pick up a shipload of slaves. If you want to get some real gruesome pictures, you know, look up the African slave trade images, and you see how the slaves were stacked in the bottom of the ship.
Oh.
You know, and I mean, it was awful. So I don't really have a short answer to your question there, Cece. It's just that was the social structure and political structure for hundreds of years. And can you imagine putting yourself in a position where you had all the power over people, all right, for hundreds of years, you and your family, and then all of a sudden somebody says, oh, that's not right. Y'all need to quit doing that. Would you be willing easily to give that up? Yeah, probably not. And it was the same way. It was the same way. So, again, since the founding of the United States, in the South, the whites had always been in power. And they weren't going to give it up easily. So they made it so blacks had no power. No power at all. Any other questions or comments? That's a good question. All right. Cece, could you turn off my camera? Ken, I will see you tomorrow. Or the next time, or whenever it is.